Why will the Russians never take Bakhmut? Stick around until the very end of this video and I'll make sure to explain every single reason why Bakhmut is an impregnable fortress of the Ukrainian front line. Starting off with what is the most prevalent issue in the area around Bakhmut are the two hills to the city's east. Here we can see this hill in the northeast. We on the channel actually call this the chicken tender due to its odd shape. It has a large round side to the west with a small tail tapering off to the east. It kind of looks to us like a chicken tender, and we've been calling it that during the entirety of the battle. This chicken tender shaped hill is incredibly important to Ukrainian defenses because it is able to overlook one of the major roadways leading into Bakhmut from the east, and not only that, it also looks onto the major highway that bypasses Bakhmut and heads in the direction of Krasnoora further to the north. These two highways are incredibly important for the Russians to capture to continue any offensives further, because through controlling these highways, they are able to control the supplies that get to their units on the front, and without them, it wouldn't be possible to supply their own forces to continue the offensive. And so, before they can even push any further into the rest of Bakhmut, they have to take the chicken tender, which means they now have to fight uphill, up the chicken tender, and try and push the Ukrainians off. And that is practically impossible in its own right, not just because the Ukrainian soldiers are by far a higher quality than the Russians on the chicken tender, but because there are two ridge lines to the west of Bakhmut that can support, it can give supporting fire to the chicken tender if the soldiers there find themselves to be in a difficult position. If you're looking at the map right now, you'll actually notice that Bakhmut is not on level ground, it's actually in a bowl of hills surrounding it. The chicken tender, the hill to the southeast, and both of the ridgelines to the northeast and actually more like the northwest and southwest, pretty much ensure that Bakhmut is inside of a bowl. And so to really control Bakhmut, you have to control all of the ridgelines and hills surrounding the town. And so even if the Russians are able to push the Ukrainians off the chicken tender, they won't be able to that well because they will be taking fire from both of these ridges behind Bakhmut that will then push them back over to the, I guess you could say, the eastern side of the chicken tender and force them to stay there. And that's why if you look at Deep State UA's map and you rewind over the past 5 days of combat, from the 4th to the 3rd, and then to the 2nd, and then to the 1st, and then to the 30th, you can see that they've made absolutely no progress on the chicken tender, save about 150 meters worth right here, which we can't really account for. One thing, though, that we did see that was very visible when we look at the Bakhmut area, and this chicken tender specifically, is that on the chicken tender right here, there's this massive opening of ground in between a large forested area. We'll call that the meat of the chicken tender, and the slightly less forested, I guess you could say, tail of the chicken tender over here. It appears that the Russians are continuously trying to push out of the small barn and across this open field, which has practically become a kill zone, as small mortar fire is able to ensure that the Russian units get suppressed or destroyed once they enter this opening, and the Ukrainians inside the tree line are wiping them out before they can even progress any further. And so, for that reason alone, and also once again looking at the supporting ridgelines to the southwest and the northwest of the town, we can tell that the chicken tender will never be able to be taken, just due to how strong of a position it is for the Ukrainians, and that will stop the Russians from taking these two major highways and also stopping their advance altogether. The only other option they have to try and take Krasnoora, which would help them to encircle Bakhmut, is to push through the open fields in between Bakhmutske and Bakhmut proper. The only problem with that, however, is that all of the fields in this area are incredibly wide open, and once again, another pitfall, Krasnoora is on a slight elevation compared to these open fields, and the open fields are in fact so large and so sparse in cover that if infantry tries to push through them, they usually get obliterated by artillery fire before they can even come in contact with the Ukrainian infantry. We actually saw this on the 4th of December, around the 284th day of war, as around 2 companies of the Wagner unit were wiped out in these fields. There were videos of dozens of bodies strewn out inside of the ditches near these tree lines, and also some of them that were caught in the open, and the 2 companies, what was left of them, routed off the field, and we haven't seen an offensive since in this area. And so this area is completely tied down by Ukrainian forces, and the Russians can't advance there, and they also cannot advance on the chicken tender. And so trying to cut off Bakhmut from the Krasnoora direction is practically impossible for all purposes concerned. However, the Russians do control a hill, a small ridge/hill shaped object in the southeast of the city of Bakhmut. they do control all sides. They even control the lower summit sides of the western side of the hill, meaning that they're actually starting to fight into Bakhmut. However, once again, they run into the same problem. The Ukrainians control the two major ridgelines here to the southwest of the town, and they're able to fire onto them at an incredible range with the infantry and also coordinate artillery fire effectively to ensure that they're not able to push into Bakhmut again. Also, the barrier unit, well, not really barrier units, more like the actual frontline fighting units of the Ukrainian armed forces in Bakhmut are also able to make sure that they do not push forward. If we go to this area once again, you can see that while it is slightly forested, it is practically a massive open plain. Not even tree lines protect Russian infantry from an advance here, and for that reason, it's highly unlikely that we'll see them pushing directly into Bakhmut to put any pressure there and distract Ukrainian forces from other parts of the front line. And even moving furthest south to probably the longest part of the Bakhmut front line, and where we've seen the most activity actually for about the past week, is the Andriivka and Kurdomivka villages and the ridgelines that span all the way from Bakhmut down to this small canal that you can find passing by Kurdomivka. This area appears to be one of the spots in the initial phase of the Second Battle of Bakhmut where the Ukrainian forces would have the most problems trying to keep the Russians at bay, and probably where the Russians would actually make a breakthrough. However, that would not be accounting the terrain again. And by and large, really the entire purpose of this video is to explain how much of a fortress the town of Bakhmut is in terms of its terrain and how difficult it will be for the Russians to push forward. For example, if we reverse about 5 days ago to the 1st of December, in fact, we'll actually have to go back further, that's how stagnant the front line is, and we go back to the 21st when the opening phases of the Second Battle of Bakhmut began, we can see that the Russians pushed along these open fields, which they did have an advantage on. And if we move down into the area of Andriivka and Kurdomivka, you can actually see that the tree lines run north to south in this area along the fields, which means that there are these breaks that they could fight through from this tree line to the next and then push forward, and they would have some concealment here as well. And that would help them a fairly good deal in dealing with Ukrainian forces, because Ukrainian infantry did not have the ability, and Ukrainian anti-tank guided missile units also didn't have the ability to destroy Russian infantry supported by armor in these fields as easily as they could have. And so the Russians did make a decent amount of ground. Once they got to Kurdomivka, however, we did notice that there would be a small problem, and this did actually incur the Russians a decent amount of casualties. Kurdomivka has massive salt plains to its southwest. Actually, southeast, sorry, correction there. And it also has a very small neck that goes up into the actual town of Kurdomivka that the Russians could push through. And so to get into Kurdomivka, they had to incur heavy casualties pushing across the open salt plains and then across the railroad tracks, across a pretty high elevation feature into the west of Kurdomivka, and then take the town itself. They also had to do something fairly similar with Andriivka, but at least in these areas, if they pushed the Ukrainians out, there was this railroad track that is a pretty high elevated feature on the map. If we look here, you can actually see that it gets its own, I guess you could say, relief features on the map because it was built up so high. And so the Russians could push up to the railroad ties and then hold that position and then prepare to push through the next open area. And so once we fast forward, we can see that they did exactly that. You can see that the front line formed directly on the railroad tracks throughout the entirety of the area. And while they pushed over for a short while on the first, they were pushed back across by withering Ukrainian fire and also some pretty precise artillery strikes from the Ukrainians as well. And so now we return to the 5th of December, really the 4th of December on this map, but the 5th of December when this video is being made. And right now, the Russians are posed with an incredibly difficult chance of trying to cover the ground in front of them and move up to the village of I believe it's Klishivka? Let me make sure on that one real quick. It is Klishkivka. And they're trying to push up towards this village, which will help them to eventually push towards Chasiv Yar, which is near the rear of Bakhmut and would threaten the Ukrainians with encirclement if they also took Krasna Ora as well, which we know they will not be able to do. However, the largest problem here, if you look at Google Maps, is that almost all of the fields are incredibly large, and while the tree lines do go opposite, I guess you could say perpendicular to their direction of advance in the future, In this area, they do not. Going towards from Andriivka and the railroad track to Klishchiivka itself, the Russians will have to literally fight down killing zones. The Ukrainians can have anti-tank guided missile units and other kinds of systems set up inside of this village, and the Russians have to advance down practically an open field, or they can try and advance down these very narrow tree lines to Klishchiivka itself and then take it. So far, we've seen that that's been entirely unsuccessful, and they're taking heavy casualties and have been pinned down in this area as well. And not only that, Klishchiivka, like many other areas on the Bakhmut front line, has a large ridge line directly behind it, which is helping the Ukrainians to fire down into pretty much these shooting range lanes and knock out the Russians whenever they move across the railroad ties. And so it seems as though there is absolutely no way at this point for the Russians to advance forward without taking massive amounts of casualties and their units being routed from the field. We've also seen that their artillery fire has been very ineffective so far in the war, which also gives us the idea that the Ukrainian defenders in this area will never be pushed off of the ridge lines and hills, because the Russian artillery is not hitting them accurately enough to suppress them or force them into a rout or a retreat. And so the Ukrainians will be able to hold the city of Bakhmut because they control all of the major ridge lines and elevation features around Bakhmut, and therefore they're preventing the town from being encircled from the Krasnohora and Chasiv Yar direction, and they're also stopping the Russians from pushing downwards into the bowl that Bakhmut's inside of and taking it and then trying to fight for the ridges to the west. And so all in all, Bakhmut will probably never be taken by Russian forces just due to the difficulty of fighting over this terrain and taking the vital areas without getting fired from so badly from other directions that you're forced to retreat. And so with that, I thank y'all so much for watching this video. If y'all did enjoy this summary, make sure to support us on Patreon. The link is in the description below, which helps me to continue to make these videos and also helps us to continue to focus on the future of this channel. Thank you all so much once again for watching. Make sure to also like, comment, and subscribe, and we will see y'all in the next one.